Okay, good morning to everybody. I'm happy to introduce Professor Peter Hanenberg lecture speech. Professor Hanenberg is the Vice Rector of the Catholic University of Portugal in Lisbon, where he teaches German and cultural studies. Professor Hanenberg is also the director of the doctoral school of the Catholic University of Portugal and has widely published on topics related to cognitive cultural studies, translation, the idea of Europe, and from a literature point of view, so to say. So, dear Peter, we are very happy to have you among us, and thank you for your availability and generosity.
Yeah, thank you, Stefano, for the invitation and for these friendly words in the beginning. And it's actually a pleasure to share some of my interests with you and to be able to hear you on this in the end when we might discuss one or the other topic. And it is actually a pleasure for us to be part of this PhD network and research network on contemporary humanism, because it is something that needs attention, needs collaboration, and needs that we join forces to get more attention to this subject. I also thank LUMSA for the invitation to our university to be part of this network. I just will try to share with you some slides that I have prepared for you, and I wonder whether you can see this now or not. Do you see something?
Yes.
Okay. And do you see the presentation mode, or do you see the other mode? Okay, anyhow. So the title of my presentation is How Culture Shapes the Mind, and I want to introduce briefly to you the concept of cognitive culture studies, because this is something which is not very popular or not even very established so far. And to do so, and as I am coming from the field of culture studies, I will do so by quoting first Raymond Williams, one of the grounding fathers of culture studies in the 20th century. And in his famous book, The Long Revolution, he already draw attention to the need to know about two things to know about contemporary society, which is there can be little doubt that henceforth we must start from the position that reality as we experience it is, in this sense, a human creation, that all our experience is a human version of the world we inhabit. This version has two main sources, and there we go: the human brain as it has evolved and the interpretations carried out by our cultures. So Raymond Williams' suggestion is to study both the brain cognitive processes, cognitive conditions of the human being as we find it today, and its relation to cultures. And this is, in the end, what I actually want to do with you today as well, to see how culture and the brain, culture and cognition meet. I will give you some brain sides, but then I will mainly concentrate on the dimension of the mind more than on the dimension of the brain as human, a part of the human body. But starting exactly at the point where Raymond Williams says that we have to recognize even any kind of experience as a human creation. I will look at this that you all know as one example of our illusions, so-called illusions, in the way that, and I hope that you agree with me, most of us think that this line is shorter than that line. And this example will tell us two things. One thing that you can already see on this slide, which is that perception, even the perception of reality, is always contextual. So we see the same thing different in a different context. It seems to be something different than when the context changes. So this seems shorter because of these arrows here. This seems longer because of these arrows here. So perception is in itself very context dependent and shaped by the context. This is the first insight which leads us to recognize how much perception and whatever we seem just to perceive or to see is already a matter of mental construction, in the sense that to what we see, we add the context in which we see it. And so come to our conclusions on what we actually perceive. This is the first important moment where we can recognize that let's say the mind and its way of shaping things by combining context and observation is actually something to be attended. The second, let's say, teaching that we can take from this is that what we have experienced in this former slide is something that most of us actually experience, and which many people experience. But it is not something that everyone experiences. So some people do not let themselves get into the illusion that this is shorter than B. And how does this come to happen? What some psychologists have found out is that actually the predisposition or the readiness to be to get into this imaginary trick has to do with culture. There is a cultural condition to being conducted to this understanding or not. And as you see here, there are actually a cultural group like American students or European students, which easily go into this illusion, whereas there are some foragers in Asia who do not see this. They see simply that this line A is the same line as B. They don't have the illusion that we have. And how does this happen to be? Depending on the culture where people live, they perceive things differently. And even these kind of seemingly basic illusions do not happen when certain cultural conditions are not given. So foragers, as those who do not perceive this, are people who do not live in an environment which proposes the existence of geometrical figures and straight lines as much as does our Western architecture or even the teaching of geometry in school and so on for all of the Western people. So living in an environment which is shaped by natural forms and not by geometrical forms, by abstract forms, induces to not being led into this illusion as was happened to the other people. I hope you see the point, which I think is amazingly interesting to recognize how the environment and the culture in which we actually live conditions even the very basic forms of conception that we have, and even lead us to illusions or not, depending on the context in which we actually were trained to perceive things. So even basic perception is already culturally shaped, and that leads me to something which I need always to explain in the beginning of anything that I say, because it is my deep conviction that culture can be actually defined and seen in three dimensions, and a proper understanding of culture needs these three dimensions. And as you see, the dimensions are the material dimension, the social dimension, and the mental dimension. In the diagram that you see, this is translated into semiotic language, certainly a discipline which has influenced my perspective on all this also strongly. That's why we are speaking here in the material dimension of texts. The argument of this diagram is to say that culture is something which expresses itself in this material dimension, being artistic work, literary works, whatever kind of artifacts, and the culture does so by sharing this artifacts, these material things in social contexts, in institutions, reaching from the family to schools and universities, but also to political organizations and what forms of social constitutions ever. And as a third element, these material dimensions and their uses count on the mental disposition and participation of the users, which organize or are organized in a way by certain codes, being these codes languages, or being these codes mentalities, being these codes norms and values, whatever can be a mental condition. And the interesting point is where the three dimensions actually meet. So when I speak about culture in the next minutes, I always address culture in these three senses, and not just in something which is only in the material dimension, as if culture were only present in artifacts. And I'm not talking about culture as being something which is just in our mind, or which is just a matter of power, as some people do, but I'm speaking of culture in this intersection of material, mental, and social dimension. And one other example that I like to give is how this material, social, and mental dimension work together is by looking at the famous example of taxi drivers in London, whose brain changes over time in the consistence of gray matter volume. It is increasing in the posterior hippocampus, and it is decreasing in the anterior. And over time, this is the time, over time, it is getting more in the posterior and less in the anterior context. And for this example simply wants to show how cultural practices like taxi driving in a certain environment actually impacts on the brain itself and how it leaves traces in the brain. So the brain is no longer the same than it would be without taxi driving. And of course, this is just one of the famous examples. One could show the same for people playing piano and those playing, let's say, string instruments. One could say the same about football players who develop certain parts of the brain in a different way than if they would not train it in the sense. It's a matter of training and a matter of exposing. And exposing and training change the manability of the brain and condition actually what the brain then performs easily and performs in a better way. Neuroscientists are aware of such importance of culture on the proper development of the brain, as was shown in one of our summer schools, for instance, but it's very well known here in Lisbon by our neuroscientist Alexander Caldas, who shared with us this slide that I want to share with you as well, because it puts culture as one of the context elements of influence on the brain. And if we understand that culture is not just whatever Caldas intends by naming it here by this topic, by this concept, one could also say that education, socioeconomic status, even maybe emotional states are also part, of course, of the mental conditions of culture, and therefore the whole context could be understood as culture. And you see how nicely this is related to a certain performance, which translates into behavior and competences, and all this forming and informing the brain in a constant way, whereas at the same time the brain offers the conditions to let this happen in the way that the brain is actually ready to be shaped. The famous plasticity of the brain, which allows the brain to adapt to different forms of whatever culture, developing different forms of performances and behaviors, some of them leading to taxi driving in London, some of them leading to see or not see a certain optic illusion. So this is the, let's say, conjuncture or the playing together of culture and cognition that I would actually like to talk about. The process of this relation is maybe itself already visible in images like you are seeing here now, which help us to understand how much the cultural expressions and cultural performances are based on other mental operations which might be more basic. So if you think about something like language, then you might recognize that some that words related to, for instance, the lag activate similar regions in the brain as the movement of the legs itself does. The same goes for arms, the same for face words, and so on. They operate in similar regions of the brain. The words operate in similar regions of the brain than the actions which belong to the word or the words. And this is a very important finding, because it allows us to imagine that words and cultural products work as if they were simulations, that abstract words or abstract notions are based also on very basic actions, very basic corporal performances, which are then developed further into higher concepts. Speaking about something and doing it is not the same, but it is situated in similar regions of the brain, so that we could maybe, generally speaking, find in simulation a principle for how culture comes into being and how culture comes into meaning. One of the books that has influenced me very much in this thinking is the book that you see here, Louder Than Words, by Benjamin Bergen. And he insists in saying that meaning making, as we know it as a cultural practice, is very much based on simulation. Simulation as creating echoes in our brain of previous experiences, as you see in this quote. And he goes even further, stating that abstract concepts like time, morality, and affection are tightly linked to the very concrete things that were experienced before. So abstraction is based on concrete experiences, and simulation is the way in which these abstractions come into being. I think this is quite an important finding for anyone studying the arts, literature, or maybe even philosophical concepts, because it binds back such artifacts and concepts to a body experience and to basic ways of performing networks in the brain. Simulation as not only leading to this simulation in arts, in theater, in literature, and so on, but in any forms of making sense of what we experience. And one of the ways of, let's say, guiding or shaping and orienting experiences and concepts is through cultural models. This is a concept developed by the anthropologist Brad Shaw already many years ago, but still I think a very useful way of understanding how actually culture shapes the mind. Actually, it shapes the mind by models. And such models can be, as you see on this slide, of linguistic quality or of non-linguistic. They can be lexical models in the way that the words a language has allows to name things, whereas if there are no words for things, there might not even be the things themselves. So these models limit the perception and the conception that people speaking a certain language have of the world. This is the underlying idea in philosophy when it says that the language sets the limits of our thinking. But this is not only limited to linguistic models, but there are also models which, for instance, say how to develop, perform, simulate, structure emotions, and how emotions actually come into meaning and into being through certain models which a culture offers, and which therefore the individuals can take up and follow. So here you see a concrete way of how cultures establish models that are shared by individuals and which are manifested in artifacts so that they can be shared and acquired by individuals, and then they are handed down from one generation to the other, and making a culture what a culture is. If we look at more sophisticated cultural models, as Bradshaw suggested, namely these cultural models which allow for functional distinctions, then I think, understand even better how much of this is a very interesting key to the understanding of culture. So we have models of time, organization, the time conception of a certain culture can be cyclical, or can be rhythmic, or can be linear. And the whole way of thinking of such a culture would then be coined or influenced by such a temporal model. And the same goes, of course, for spatial models, or for diagnostic models, and all forms of orientation that models can offer. As one of the let's say, for me, more interesting examples, I used to refer to the scripts. So certain rules of how to do things, and scripts can be, for instance, how to have a coffee at a certain place. And you all know that having a coffee in Rome is different from having a coffee in New York, or having a coffee in Vienna. And what it means to have a coffee follows a different script from place to place. And people have to know the script to behave properly, having a coffee in Rome or having a coffee in Vienna. And the same goes for other kind of scripts, how to perform a relationship between a man and a woman, and how it ends. Former times had the script of being the marriage, the last step for before death. This script had these two important moments of marriage and death, whereas today's scripts seem to introduce up to a certain point not the need, but the possibility of separation and divorce and so on and so forth. And people follow no longer the older script, but follow a newer script, which is suggested, for instance, through media and through literature in many forms and so on and so forth. So this is one example of how cultural models actually could perform, could allow to perform in a certain circumstances, and how this, let's say, models and indications also change over time. I think the importance of cultural models in this triangular relation between social, mental, and material is something which is very explanatory and refers to the essential work of culture. And to reconnect this also to what the role the brain plays in all this. The brain plays the role of an instance which actually performs certain models, which with more easiness and more readiness, as we saw in the example of taxi driving, because the brain is trained in certain models and in certain forms of doing things, and is supported by basic experiences which then shape also the more abstract simulations and conclusions one can take in a certain situation, so that the brain is in permanent exchange with its environment, as we saw on the slide of our neuroscientist. So what I wanted to suggest here at that point is that these kind of experiences translated into or shaped into models form a kind of tacit knowledge which underlies our behavior through in routines which the brain itself suggests or develops or runs. And this is what I would like to call tacit knowledge, those kind of conditions in thinking and conditions of our mind which we are not aware of, but in a certain sense are the water in which our fish is swimming. It is so natural to us to conceive things on the basis of these experiences, on the basis of these models, that we don't even question it as a condition. So tacit knowledge as something which shapes our behavior in a very deep way and writes itself into the brain, leaving traces and leaving new structures of the brain by continuous application. Tacit knowledge is one of the keywords that I would like to share with you in this topic. And the second keyword that I wanted to share with you is intramental translation. And as you see on this slide, the idea of intramental translation goes back to what we were saying in the very beginning in terms of Raymond Williams' quote, which is the meeting of experience and cultural models or cultural meanings, which actually build our way of understanding the world and performing meaning. This is a conceptual blending approach, as some of you might have recognized, and it is a very basic, and in this representation also seems to be a very mechanical operation, what it is not. But it helps us to understand how in our mind and in cultural meaning, both pre-existing cultural models which conceive our perception actually blend together into a percept which is meaningful. This would then be the instrumental translation when it comes to see something, and you see something and then you recognize, oh, it is an elephant and not a mouse. Then you map the concept of the elephant with what you see to the meaning of the elephant out there. This is, of course, very simplistic, and as you saw with the example of the elephant, it is even in this simple structure not. We have to do two steps. We have to recognize that some thing is happening in a first step when actually the perception and the conception of the elephant blend into, oops, this what I see fits into my concept of the elephant, before being able to say this and to give a word to this. So here is a lot of tacit knowledge and a lot of tacit conditions, whereas on the second instrumental translation, then we have the expression, the explicit knowledge, the saying as such. And I think it's very important to recognize how much cultural models actually impact on the whole process, and how much the whole process could neither be occur without these cultural models and also not without, of course, the concrete perception. As I was saying, one should not understand what I've named instrumental translation as this mechanic process that it seems to be, but we have to understand it as a permanent process, or as Douglas Hofstadter would suggest, as a strange loop in which we never know in which moment of the operation we actually are. It is a mutual, continuous, looping condition of conditions, and that might be one of the figures of understanding instrumental translation and the work of cultural models better than in the schematic representation that I have shown before. Or on another step, certainly we cannot perceive these processes as following a classical physical operation of melting, bringing two things together and melting them in one, but we might have to recognize that they are working not in a logical sequence or in a way that we can establish cause and reason, but we and effects, but that we have to recognize a permanent wave of interference of the elements in playing together in this schema. So a quantum perspective on instrumental translation would certainly introduce a different complexity, which is closer to our human experiences. But maybe the mechanic representation helps us to do the first step in recognizing the elements which are involved in it. This is then a preparation to maybe understand our mind as a predictive instrument, as was suggested recently, and to see our mental processes in the conjuncture of culture and perception, of cognition and culture, as a form of prediction. The mind is permanently trying out whether it gets the world right or not, and is correcting its own performance on the basis of the feedback offered by what then experience tells further. This is a concept which I think will help us to understand better the role of the elements which allow for prediction in this process. Or you could also ask Charlie Brown, who already knew very well that looking at clouds is not a matter of actually seeing certain forms, but it is of a matter of projecting forms into what we actually see, and then getting the imagination running on its own. So experience-based and concept-oriented, that's what our brain does. Concept-oriented by cultural models, which are the means to structure experience and to give meaning to experience. If Stefano, I ask you, do we have some more 5 minutes?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so then I would actually like to give you one example of how this works concretely, suggesting what I've taken from Benjamin Bergen's book, the image of flying pigs. I think that you all, in the meanwhile, while I'm talking, have already imagined what flying pigs might look like. And it is interesting that you are able to do so, though you are aware that there are no flying pigs at all. But by simply merging flying and pigs, you get something, and this something might look like this. For those who are trained in the 20th or 21st century, or it might look like this for those who are more trained in classical issues. So if you see flying pigs as super swine, or if you see flying pigs as Pegasus, this depends actually on the cultural experiences, the cultural models which are prominent in your imagination and which therefore shape what you imagine when you hear some word. And again, this is a simple process in which a concept, in this case actually two concepts, the flying concept and the pig or swine concept, come together to build something new. This is the highly productive form of using cultural models and the processes of the brain as creative production and as a means to creativity. So with this example, we might actually recognize what cognitive culture studies could offer to the understanding of culture. And on this slide, you see some of the let's say conceptual concepts which underlie cognitive culture studies. The plasticity of the brain, formable, but its solidification in the sense that taxi drivers then actually have their brains solidified in a different way than bus drivers would have in London. The relation of perception, conception, and acception together in one process. The importance of simulation, the role of tacit knowledge, the work of instrumental translation, but also in the form of its quantum interpretation as predictive mind. And finally, how this might be the condition for this process of conceptual blending as happening when you see flying pigs. So this would be the concepts underlying cognitive culture studies from the side of cognition. And as you see now on the left side, this addresses a lot of topics which are classical topics in the field of culture studies, talking about issues of empathy, trauma, memory, and so on and so forth, to which the conceptual framework of cognitive culture studies could actually fruitfully be applied. And that this is something we could use for the understanding of contemporary culture and contemporary society. I will very briefly address in these 4 points in the next 4 or 5 slides. And they address issues which are very relevant to us today. The first is something that you all know, is how much memory and storage of knowledge is an issue in learning in our today's society, and mainly so because we have a history of developing instruments to storage memory. Starting from the book, going to the printed book, and maybe then coming to the cell phone and the computer and the internet, we develop actually matters of coming to terms with the challenges of storing memory, which are very interesting. It is easy to understand that the use of such instruments has had a big impact on how the brain actually performs. And today's brain is performing certainly in a very different way than those brains which were in action before, for instance, learning to read and write, or learning to be submitted to a reading culture in the Gutenberg galaxy, and changes which come up now in our society, which is getting less influenced by reading and writing, and seems to go back to something as a visual culture, performed more by the perception of images and by the perception of words and sentences in a line. So technologies of memory storage impact actually on the way of how we make use of the brain and how the brain works. So using a cell phone is not an innocent act for the brain, but it leaves traces as much as taxi driving leaves traces in the brain of London taxi drivers. This actually allows us to be at least aware of how much such uses of technology can impact on the brain. The second thing is the institution of such technologies. As I was saying, books and cell phones are one example, but all kind of mental institutions which actually help us to expand the capacity of our brain. And I'm obviously speaking here about of issues like artificial intelligence, which will actually have an impact on how we make use of our brain in the future. the brain will not stay unimpressed by its concurrence in artificial intelligence. On a completely different level, one might talk about the need of not taking everything that can be said about the brain as the last word about humans at all. There is also, of course, the need for critical neuroscience, in the sense that today we find many applications also going into artificial intelligence, which suggests the uses of neurosciences in the sense of enhancing economy and enhancing profit as a neurocapitalism. And of course, this is not something which the humanities should fall in, but they should keep their critical eye aware of how much we are negotiating central human interests in this debate. And maybe this is a very nice conclusion, that we all should be able to understand those processes happening in the brain and conditioning our understanding, and therefore shaping our culture as well. But we should also see the impact on the other hand, how the culture itself impacts on the brain. And that is the quote with which I might finish. This in turn will allow us to better understand the ways in which our social worlds, no matter how historically contingent, both shape and are shaped by our biology, and our biology being shaped and shaping our cultural conditions. So cognitive culture studies might actually help us to understand the work of culture as such, and might also help us to understand how our mind works, so that we can produce meaning in our contemporary society. So thank you for your listening and your attention, and I'm very much hoping that you have a lot of questions and contradictions to present.